the right thing to do is to listen and to understand and to have respect for those with whom we disagree. Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka. I'm AEI Senior Vice President for Foreign and Defense Policy Studies, and I'm really happy to be sitting here with Vikram Singh, who is a Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress. Together, we have been working on what I think is one of our most important projects, and what's best about it is it's a joint and a shared project between the American Enterprise Institute and the Center for American Progress, really on, we've called it defending democracy, but it's much more, and in some ways a little less too, because this is a project that is looking into the roots of political and economic discontent in our societies. It's looking at the drivers of what's been called the populist phenomenon. It's looking at the feeling of disenfranchisement that has driven many voters to alternative choices. And it looks at the limits of debate. Where should we be going? What should we be doing? How should we be fixing things? And what should we not be doing in order to underwrite the kind of societies that, and the kind of political systems that will be responsive to citizens?
Well, I'm really glad to join you for this, and thanks to AEI for hosting and being a partner with the Center for American Progress in this really, what I feel is an extremely important piece of work. We were wondering not only why it is that we see sort of extreme rhetoric and extreme populism appealing to voters in the United States, but all over the world, like you said. It's sort of a global phenomenon. And it seems like no mature democracy is really exempt from this trend. So, what we were wondering is what's going on? Is it as big a problem as it feels to a lot of people in the center? What is it a product of? And what kind of a demand signal is it sending for democratic governments and democratic institutions? What needs to change to basically make people feel more confident in democracy going forward? And I think having it be a project that was really run with a view of looking across the political spectrum, across ideologies, by people who believe in sort of the fundamental democratic values of freedom of expression, of a free press, of independent judiciary, of strong democratic institutions that look out for the rights of all people. I think that made it a really exciting project. So thanks a lot for having me, and look forward to discussing it.
So one of the takeaways from the work that our scholars did together was about the nature of the conversation that's being had. So before we dive into the parties, who they are, let's just talk a little bit about the conversation. The word that they used and recommended against was "stop the condescension." How do you see that?
So I think it's really an interesting question. What happened after the Cold War was this sort of triumphal moment for liberal democracy, small L liberal democracy. It seemed like pretty obvious, this is now the model of governance that makes the most sense. And here we are a few decades later. And not only is it not obvious, there are viable competitive models out there, and the citizens of liberal democracies are not necessarily convinced that their leaders have brought them to the best place. For the United States, it's things like, endless ongoing wars. It's the global financial crisis. I think are things that were underpinning a sense of maybe our leaders don't have the answers, and maybe our system isn't really working. And yet, I think there was a feeling that grew very widespread on the left and the right that most political leaders were saying, no, but we do have the answers. It's all fine. It's okay.
Just trust us.
Trust us. We're going to, we have this mess, mistake. We're going to fix it. And I think people became less and less credulous of that. And so in many, many countries, politicians who probably were highly marginal or, impossible to imagine being successful, started to recognize this and started to address those concerns. And I think there's a gap therefore, between populists resonating with real concerns that real people have that are not figments of their imagination, and a sense that mainstream politicians, both on the left and the right, just haven't been resonating, haven't been addressing those issues.
So one of the things I said to you when we were chatting before was that I remember this phrase that I kept hearing throughout the American election, which was, people just don't know what's good for them. The notion that somehow we are in a paternalistic society and that politicians represent, and political parties represent that parental instruction, no, don't touch that flame, I know that's going to be bad for you, is really something that I think gets to the heart of this. Because too often, and I hear this all the time in Washington, but in London and in Paris and in Brussels and in Berlin, really around the world, we hear this, which is, people just don't get it. They don't know what's good for them. And this is fostered contempt for elites as well. This unbelievably condescending, paternalistic notion that somehow people are not the best judges of what is best for them.
And people know that they are part of the solution to their own problems.
Absolutely.
And they want to be a part of the solution.
And that's a
to their own
fundamental of
challenges.
democracy.
One of the interesting things I found that was universal throughout the multiple workshops we had and all of the academics and other experts that we talked to was a real consensus that it wasn't that extreme populist politicians and parties were really savvy, but it was more that the traditional parties, in our country, the Democratic and Republican Party, the establishment, but in other countries, just the mainstream parties, had left the space, had left a void, and had basically mismanaged themselves into a position where they were being dramatically challenged, in some cases, like in France, sort of to the death, by new faces and new forces, and often those were very extreme.
Right. So, you use this expression, extreme populism, which I think is something that will stick in people's craws unless we're careful about defining it. So, when we talk about somebody who represents the will of the people, then, then it's probably wrong. Where do we draw the line? And I think the answer is we draw the line at a place where the rhetoric and the ideas of these kinds of individuals and movements step on democratic rights, step on democratic freedoms. So it's not that it's not Brexit. We may disagree with Brexit, we may agree with it, but it's not Brexit. It's not the notion that the euro didn't work or that NAFTA isn't a great solution. It is more the press should no longer be allowed to say and do what it wants. It's what we're seeing now in Hungary. It's this stepping over the line. It's some of the things we heard from Marine Le Pen in France. It's not Donald Trump per se, or even some of the parties in Europe. What it is that that unwillingness to understand what the spectrum of democratic ideals is.
So this is where it gets really challenging.
Yes.
Because I would say it's not Donald Trump always, but it is Donald Trump sometimes. So the part of what Donald Trump did effectively here was hear concerns and echo them and resonate, right? Where he started crossing the line was saying, I can't be judged fairly by a quote-unquote Mexican judge or something like that,
exactly.
Right?
And I think there's a lot of agreement about that.
And so what you see now is one of the questions becomes, how do the institutions do when, faced with the worst inclinations of leaders, often populist leaders? And if they're Erdogan or Orban, you see the institutions failing to be able to withstand the onslaught. So when you're stacking the courts, or when you're shutting down, taking possession of and shutting down newspapers you don't like, then you've definitely crossed the line. But the challenge is, can standing up for the rule of law and free speech and those fundamental values in most of the democracy's founding documents, can that not be populist in and of itself? Can leaders not say, like, it is populist and it is patriotic to demand that we don't take these actions that like weaken our fundamental democratic institutions.
Okay, so I want to talk about patriotism and nationalism in 1 second, but I want to come back to a word that you used that I think our scholars and those who we brought into this project agreed was really important, and that is institutions. So, what are the pillars of these democracies? It is in fact the institutions rather than the political parties. And I think that's a little bit of a blurring of a line too, it's the Republican and the Democratic Party, or it's the CDU and the CSU and the socialist parties that are the pillars in Europe. And the answer, of course, is that's not true. It's actually the courts. It's actually the legislative system. It's actually the elections. It's actually these sorts of things. And there's been a huge erosion of confidence in those institutions as well, which should be a wake-up call, and perhaps hasn't been as much. I know. Just to take it to my own side, I know when I talk to my students at Georgetown, one of the things I too often hear from them is, well, we should let the courts decide. And the answer is, well, guys, no, that's not right. The court is not the arbiter of all things that are right and good. In fact, you need to have trust in other institutions, and if you don't, we need to fix that. We don't need to start naming other institutions that we trust more.
Right. We need to have trust in the legislature, trust in the executive, trust in the judiciary. They need to be independent and functioning. But one of the things that is happening is it's a product of gridlock and an environment, I think, in a lot of countries where compromise started being equated to surrender.
Right.
And in most democracies, without compromise, you have gridlock. And with gridlock, you have frustration.
Well, look at Greece. I mean, how do we
Exactly.
end up with a left-wing populist party there? Because their government could not come to an answer.
Right.
Could not compromise about the kind of economic steps that were necessary to take given their economic malfeasance for all of those years. I think that's absolutely true. Let's talk about patriotism and nationalism, because of course I think Americans often see this very different than Europeans, partly because of the legacy of World War II being fought on European soil, partly because our traditions just are different. But this is something that we talked about recapturing, which is the power of patriotism. What was your thinking about it?
So I think this is really deeply important. If there's not one thing that's happening is people want to have a sense of belonging and a sense of pride, including a sense of national pride. And I think that globalization, transnational governance, you think all these things have sort of become, in many cases, symbols more than real threats, but sort of things that seem to override, what defines a particular culture or a particular place. And I think that politicians that don't heed that, don't pay attention to that, don't sort of tap into that, have trouble. So it's interesting to see how a leader like Macron has handled that in France. He basically tried to be a fairly French nationalist politician, but who was still pro-Europe, right?
And he's still weaving that thread.
And it's very tricky. And I think one of the problems is that this is hard for politicians in the center have generally put a lot of faith in sort of technocratic solutions, and we're going to try to figure out the best method for preserving the welfare state while having a functioning capitalist economy that can be dynamic and lead to entrepreneurship and all these other things,
and employment.
And a lot of the debate is about the balance between that. A lot of the left-right debate is about how much to do one or the other. What are the impact of taxes and things like that?
So there have been interesting proxy fights about this,
right.
Which we haven't paid attention to. We've engaged in them, but we haven't paid attention to their meaning. I think back to stuff that I know in Washington is viewed with a lot of contempt, which is flag burning. But I think back to this vehement debate between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama about American exceptionalism. This is really where I think the admonition that you just gave, which is that we need to let people be proud actually of their country, and that actually that's not xenophobic and it's not bad, and restoring that patriotic pride in yourself, in your institutions, in your governance, in your people, in your leadership is actually a good thing. It doesn't need to be exclusive of foreigners. It doesn't have to be I'm an American and therefore Mexicans stink. It should be I'm an American and I'm very proud of who we are.
I mean, ironically, it's among immigrants that you actually see a lot of this patriotism, right? So you see if you go to a naturalization ceremony, this is a highly emotional, highly patriotic moment in the lives of all of these people who are following this basically founding tradition of the United States of coming to America to make a better life.
But is that true in Europe too?
I think it's different in Europe. I think in Europe things are a lot more rooted in tradition. Nationalism is more, and I think this is one of the reasons you see Europe having a harder time with the integration of newcomers, is it is more rooted in traditional values and a traditional sense of what it is to be French. I think you see some of that being touted by more extreme forces here, sort of a blood and soil nationalism. But I don't think it has broad resonance in the United States, because in the United States, it's loyalty to an idea. Rather than to a language or a culture, and I think that is both still very powerful. I think it also gives the United States. We're issuing a paper on sort of what's happening in Europe and what's happening in the United States based on these conversations this week. Those two papers show how a common thing is happening, how it's very different in different places, and how it is actually the solutions are going to also be particular to each particular polity. And the United States, in my mind, is actually better positioned to sort of come through a moment of fear and anger stronger.
I agree with you. Actually, I think our weirdly our roots on this are deeper, and of course part of it is that we are a very big country. We are not 28 different countries trying to find a modus vivendi and a modus operandi. We know what our modus vivendi and our modus operandi are. Sometimes we lose sight of it.
When we don't have we don't suffer from what I think afflicts the Europeans, which is that the union, that the thing that's pulling them together is a much more recent phenomenon, and it is not one that actually has a patriotism behind it.
No, so, right. It's entirely technocratic.
It's entirely technocratic, and there's some of the academics we worked with have done studies of how there was this paradox for Europe, which is that actually to get Europe done required a sort of technocratic approach that you could tell people, don't worry, this is no big deal. It's just good for everybody, and it's not a threat. But doing that also meant that it was sort of a detached, alien thing around which people didn't have an emotional connection.
And of course the nature of elections to the political structures in Europe are kind of distant from people.
Very distant, and therefore often captured by extremes, much like you see in say sort of political primaries here, which tend to be more the province of the extremes on both sides, the most motivated,
self-selecting crowds. Exactly.
In Europe.
So what's interesting there is this admonition in both the papers, both on Europe and on the United States, from our scholars saying basically all solutions are also local.
Yes.
You really do actually need to look at what's driving unhappiness, disenfranchisement, a sense of not being part of what's driving that country forward, being left behind, and looking at it on each level. I've mentioned this several times before and to many people, but it's stayed with me. One of the participants in one of the workshops that we did brought along this excellent graph with a line of what the median of German political views was, right, and then the drift leftwards of almost all German political parties, so that even the most conservative parties, the CDU and the CSU, traditionally what are considered right-wing on the German spectrum, were to the left of the German average. Now, again, the people who we tend to know in Washington tend to be those CDU, CSU, and SPD elites, who are around there. But that means that there's this whole space to the right of them that is occupied by nothing except an extremist party, the AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, Alternative for Germany. And that's not a surprise then, therefore, that people look and think, okay, well, I guess I can not go with my values and my concerns on this side, or I can just vote for those guys in the hope that they're going to yank us back.
Right.
They're going to bring us somehow back. And, again, what the desire is to say, Germany's going back toward Nazism. Germany, they just can't help themselves. And the answer is no, actually, there's a void. Someone else should fill it. There should be a competition.
Right. So the question is, can you fill this void? This is where on both sides you get in trouble with sort of ideas about irredeemable
right, the
groups
deplorables
among your supporters,
yes.
right?
Yes.
So this is that there are, and the fact is that, well, of course there are people that have views that you really wouldn't want translated
right.
into national policy
right.
on both sides. And one of the key things, one of the reasons we were able to do this is that we have examples of left and right wing extreme populism or authoritarian populism taking hold. So you have a Venezuela, right? You have a Turkey. You have moves in Poland that are very troubling. And what you see is that the extremes don't lead to good outcomes. And so the fear is, and I think this is driving a lot of confusion for mainstream parties. The fear is that if you don't fight back effectively, you end up with policy directions that can be quite destructive. Especially if they are nativist and exclusionary and basically foment violence or real fissures in society.
Right. You've got to listen, and this is the one lesson I think, one of many that's very important from Donald Trump. The expression that he uses that I think is hugely resonant is, "I keep my promises." Now, we may disagree about that, but we should be spending a lot more time thinking about the resonance and the value of those words, because I think that's where the confidence has fallen. It is, you guys don't keep your promises. You're not listening to me, and you don't keep your promises, and that is a common thread, no matter where you look.
So I think, and that's where I think that politicians can disagree with elements of their base and their supporters in an honest and transparent way and get more mileage than they expect to get. So
leadership.
Right. So I
but not detachment.
So to point to a positive example, when faced with these sort of xenophobic, nativist, awful claims about Barack Obama, John McCain was willing to say on national television directly to a constituent, well, that's just not true, right?
Right.
What you say about Barack Obama not being born in the United States, that's just not true.
But that's a conversation that ought to happen, and it doesn't happen enough.
Right.
And you know what? John McCain still had enough respect for that individual to answer his question.
Right. And not to denigrate.
Yeah.
It was very interesting. He did it very gently. It was a respectful. It was not a "you're awful for thinking that,"
right, so,
but it was standing firm on his values and having lines that he wouldn't cross, even when interacting with people who might be in a place that he wouldn't be, but who are voters and citizens. And so I think this is a seminal challenge. And I don't know what the dynamics are very different. In the United States, we're not going to have a brand new political party emerge like you might see in European countries, as we saw in France, that will somehow surge to the forefront.
We see in Italy and Austria.
We see in Italy, we see in Austria. Yeah, you're not going to have that here. And so it's a different, there's different avenues. You can go to the populists in a constructive way, to the base. You can try to outdo the worst. You can try to come up with a different course that still is like making sure you're hearing the discontents and actually trying to address them, not just try to skirt by them, right? And I don't know what that looks like in our system.
Well, I think that you picked out the one word that I liked a lot, and it's the perfect place for us to end, because we came into this with a spirit of inquiry, not a spirit of superior knowledge, and with a lot of respect, not just for each other, but also for people who are unhappy with their systems. The right thing to do is to listen and to understand and to have respect for those with whom we disagree. It's a huge and increasingly evanescent part of our political life. But that respect is key. Vikram, thank you so much. Thank you
Danny.
for doing this with us, and certainly I want to say thank you to our scholars for working on this, to Dalibor Rojas, who really did the lion's share, and I know that
Liz Kennedy on our team,
and
Matt
Matt
Brown, and Carolyn Kenny.
A terrific group of people, and proof positive that that people of goodwill with respect to each other can actually do things that we hope will make a difference.
Even when we disagree.
Even when we disagree. Thank you. Hey everyone, that's the end of our discussion with the Center for American Progress's Vikram Singh. Thanks for watching, and as always, let us know what other topics you'd like AEI scholars to cover on Viewpoint. And to learn more about our joint AEI CAP project on defending democracy, check the links in the description below.